Hi, Dave. Thank you. Well, a bill to legalize online sports betting in Wisconsin could go up for a vote in the state assembly before the end of next month.
If signed into law by the governor, Wisconsin's tribes would have the exclusive right to conduct online sports betting. This aligns with the state constitution, restricting most gambling to those tribal lands. New at 5, Chief Political Reporter Jason Zimmerman is in the studio with the latest details on this. Jason.
County Speaker Robin Vos has told members of the media he intends to bring the bill forward for a vote and believes it will pass. However, Assembly Republicans say some adjustments are being made to ensure there's support among their members. What we don't know is where the bill stands in the state Senate. The legislation as it is now would allow people to place bets from anywhere in the state using their mobile devices as long as the wages are processed by servers physically located on tribal lands. This is something similar to what's being done in other states, including Florida. There is opposition from groups like the Sports Betting Alliance, which represents both DraftKings and FanDuel. Also voicing concern is the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, which claims the bill has constitutional issues. When it comes to any specific changes the bill would face in the Assembly, State Representative David Steffen was tight-lipped.
I can't disclose all the adjustments. I can tell you that we've had to make some changes in order to get enough votes within even our own caucus on this issue. And that's part of the process, especially when we've got a thin majority in the Assembly as well as on the Senate side.
I did reach out to the Oneida Nation about this bill. So far, they have not responded. Many Democrats also speaking out in support as long as the legislation meets one condition. Those details coming up tonight on Action 2 News at 10. Cami, back to you.
Jason.